Hey everybody, we're back again with another episode of the Baptist Directory. I'm Dr. Michael Schultz, and today we will be looking at Dr. John Leadley Dagg, who was born on the 13th of February, 1794, and died on the 11th of June, 1884. John Dagg is one of those individuals that you probably don't know him. He's one of these guys that he's a pastor's pastor, a theologian's theologian. And if you were to look back a few generations at the guys that we now esteem as some of the leading theologians of the Baptist world, they probably were reading John Dagg. I want to open up with a couple of quotes that were said about Dr. Dagg so that you'll get an idea of the kind of esteem that he had in his era. In a letter that Dagg received following the troubled 1841 Triennial Convention in Baltimore, which is where the issue of slavery really became so obviously divisive that the next Triennial Convention resulted in the separation of the Northern and Southern Baptist conventions, Spencer H. Cone wrote a letter to Dr. Dagg saying, "I was much disappointed in not seeing you in Baltimore. The idea that you lacked influence either with the North or the South I cannot for a moment admit. For I know no one whose voice would have commanded more respect in our anxious and important session." In 1879, Dr. W. H. Whitsitt, at one time president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, proposed that the Southern Baptist Convention authorize a catechism containing the substance of the Christian religion, which was to be drawn up by the Venerable J. L. Dagg. In 1893, almost 40 years after his retirement, a new theology professor was appointed at Mercer, and his endorsement to the Georgia Baptist Convention was simply, "It would be sufficient to say that he was a student under the incomparable theological teacher, Reverend J. L. Dagg, and that he uses Dagg's Systematic Theology as a textbook." W. T. Brantley, writing about John Dagg, said, "Dr. Dagg, though very early compelled to relinquish the pulpit, has been preaching with his pen on such grand themes that he must continue to speak long after his tongue is silent." J. B. Jeter described Dagg. He said, "His manner was calm and slow, his voice was distinct and solemn, his style was pure, condensed, and vigorous, his gestures were sparing but appropriate, and his thoughts were pertinent, weighty, and impressive." Tom Nettles, that eminent church historian of our generation, has said, "No theological writer of the 19th century surpasses John L. Dagg. The persuasiveness of his arguments and the relevance of his broad insight demonstrate that such achievements would be extraordinary for any man in normal health. However, when we realize that Dagg was virtually blind, mute, and crippled at the time of his most feverish activities, such an achievement is beyond our comprehension." E. Y. Mullins, that one-time president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Southern Baptist Convention, and Baptist World Alliance, wrote of Dagg that he was one of the most conspicuous figures among Baptists of the South during the 19th century. His work on theology has exerted a widespread and powerful influence throughout the South as well as elsewhere. And truly his was a life rich in influence for good, and these influences continue in power to the present hour. W. L. Kirkpatrick, a student at Mercer during Dagg's presidency there, was one time asked about Dagg, and he said, "He can neither read nor write, he can neither walk nor talk, but he is a very good president." Patrick H. Mell, he spoke of Dagg's presidency at Mercer, saying, "He found the university in a state of depression and left it in a high state of prosperity. I never knew of a better or more successful college president than John Dagg. In his commencement addresses alone, I never knew of anyone who on any occasion so successfully unsealed the fountain of tears as Dr. Dagg always did." Page Patterson wrote of Dagg, "Every pastor, teacher, and seminary student should give himself the opportunity to familiarize himself with the ideas of John Dagg, one of our most sublime Baptist forefathers." E. Brooks Holyfield identified Dagg as a gentleman theologian. And S. G. Hillier, who was Dagg's son-in-law, wrote of him saying, "Dr. Dagg was preeminently distinguished for the dignity of his manners. He impressed all who approached him with profound respect. As a conversationalist, I never knew his superior. He was cheerful but never light. Without the least ostentation, his words were words of wisdom. Hence he was a wise and safe counselor, and his influence over those with whom he associated was almost oracular. He loved the Bible, and his mind glowed with the light of its revelations. So, who is this man? Well, born in a log cabin on the 13th of February, 1794, near Middleburg in Loudoun County, Virginia, John Leadley Dagg was the first of 8 children born to Robert Dagg and Sarah Davis Dagg. His parents took his first name from his paternal great-grandfather, John Dagg, who was a shipmaker who came to Virginia from Bristol, England, soon after the year 1700. His middle name was taken from his maternal grandmother, Sarah Leadley, and yes, it is pronounced Leadley. The name derives from the Northern English surname Laidlaw, and perhaps nobody will ever care about that but me, and that's okay. His father, Robert, was the village postmaster and saddler, and his mother, Sarah, was a homemaking daughter of a stonemason. These were the humble beginnings of John Leadley Dagg. His mother, Sarah, was reared in a religious household, with her parents being sure that she could recite the Presbyterian Catechism at a very young age, but his father, Robert, had no such religious tendencies. By the time John was born, neither parent had an affinity for religious observances, and it wasn't until the age of 8 that John saw either parent express interest in religion whatsoever. But at that time, William Parkinson, who later became the minister of the First Baptist Church of New York City, was on a preaching tour through Virginia, and both of John's parents attended what would today be called a revival meeting. There, both parents made a profession of faith and were joined to the Baptist Church at Long Branch, about 4 miles from Middleburg, where they lived. When John turned 9, his mother placed him in an academy that was newly opened in Middleburg under the tutelage of Principal William Williamson, a Presbyterian clergyman. However, only 2 years later, his mother died, and his father withdrew him from the school to begin work at his saddle shop in order to help bring in money and provide an education for the 7 younger children. Years later, John's son-in-law S.G. Hillier would write that in his discussions with Dagg, Dagg indicated that these were the only 2 years of formal education he ever received in his entire life, and those notably in early boyhood. At the age of 13, Dagg's father told him that a Middleburg man had approached him about needing a full-time worker to clerk a new dry goods store in town. The pay would be very little, but it would include a room upstairs over the store itself. Dagg's father had volunteered him for the job. And so it was that at the age of 13, John L. Dagg moved out of his home and began working full-time as a clerk over a dry goods store. There was very little pay, leading to Dagg continuing to work with his father in the saddler shop after hours, but this new living arrangement did provide him ample opportunity to dive into his real passion, education, uninterrupted. John was an unappeasable autodidact, devouring anything and everything that he could get his hands on to read. He was deeply fascinated by mathematics and soon became so much better with numbers than the owner of the store that he was designated as the official bookkeeper and accountant of the store in addition to being the clerk. But aside from his mathematical skills, he consumed classical literature and even achieved reading proficiency in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew by the age of 15. In fact, within a year, the 14-year-old John Dagg was asked to begin working as a teacher at a school in the nearby area called Landmark Hill. And Dagg undoubtedly enjoyed teaching, as it became an element of his life which would follow him throughout his final days. And perhaps it was his joy of teaching at this early age of 14 that provoked in him a desire to know the answer to a question that many teens begin wrestling with around that time. What was his calling in life? He testified in his autobiography that around this time, he began feeling a call toward theological studies. But what's interesting is his rationale for why. He had studied mathematics and Greek and Latin and Hebrew because in his day and in his life he felt that these fields were practical and very useful. But similarly, he considered the study of God and all theology to be not only for intellectual growth, but for practical application. And this would become a theme that would follow Dagg for the rest of his life. Now, at this point, he had already read Richard Baxter's Call to the Unconverted. He'd also already read John Bunyan's Heavenly Footman. But he testifies that he didn't find these books to be particularly helpful. It was around his 15th birthday that he procured a copy of Thomas Stackhouse's History of the Holy Bible, as well as Thomas Boston's Human Nature in its Fourfold State. And these two books were markedly different for him. He notes that the day before his 15th birthday, he was walking to work at the school, and he prayed that as I was born on this day into the natural world, may the Lord bring me this day into the spiritual world. That evening, he records, while in prayer to God, my soul was relieved by a joyful sense of divine acceptance. So he returned to Mr. Williamson to tell him of these developments and to ask him to continue studying under him. And Williamson spent the next 2 years giving personal private tutoring to Dagg in the subject of Latin, until in 1810 Dagg received the offer to come and apprentice under Dr. E.B. Grady as a medical student. Now Dagg, although thoroughly convinced of the value of Christianity and its personal effect on his life, still wasn't sure of what his calling was going to be in life, and so he continued as a medical apprentice studying medicine under Dr. Grady until 1814. And during this time, Dagg experienced major events that would shape his life. One was when Andrew Broadus visited Loudoun County, Virginia in 1811, and while his sermons didn't make much impact on Dagg, Dagg says that his hymns profoundly impressed him. And this served as a religious awakening for Dagg, and he became convinced for the first time since his conversion 2 years prior that he needed to join a church. But this caused serious questions for him, because all of his friends were Presbyterian, but his parents and several of the authors that he was reading were Baptist. Now his father, mostly due to side work selling pamphlets, had many old editions of a magazine entitled the Virginia Religious Magazine, which was at that point a very theologically rich Presbyterian periodical. And Dagg read these old editions with particular interest in the doctrine of infant baptism, but he found the arguments therein rather uncompelling. He was so uncompelled that he felt the need to write counter articles critiquing the points that they made, although these articles turned out to be purely for his own benefit because they were never published anywhere. But he became so convinced of believers' baptism that he applied for membership at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Bloomfield, Virginia, under the pastorate of Elder William Fristow at the time. And he was baptized there in 1812 at the age of 18. That same year, he'd be drafted into the military for the War of 1812, and he was present at the Battle of Fort McHenry, the battle that inspired the American national anthem. After returning from the war, he concluded his apprenticeship under Dr. Grady, who said in 1814 that Dagg was equipped to practice medicine on his own. But leaving to start a medical practice didn't seem to satisfy his inward longings. And so now at the age of 20, Dagg continued working on his linguistic mastery in Latin and Greek under the tutelage of Mr. Cuthbert Powell of Middleburg. In his 21st year, he wrote a review of John M. Mason's Essay on the Church of God, which Mr. Powell found so persuasive that he actually urged Dagg to go into the field of law. He might have followed his advice, but in 1816, Ebenezer Baptist Church passed a resolution calling for Dagg to exercise his gifts in their meetings. And he says that this left him with a choice to make. He could continue pursuing medicine, he could pursue law, either of which promised honor and affluence, or he could become a Baptist minister, which in his words promised only reproach and poverty. So he writes, "In full view of the contrast, my heart said, 'Give me reproach and poverty, if I may serve Christ and save souls.' And from that hour, I have never doubted my call to the ministry." Dagg began preaching then in 1816, and the next year, 1817, he was ordained into the ministry. And life seemed to be on the up and up for the young Dagg at this point. That same year, he would marry Fanny H. Thornton on the 18th of December, 1817, and he was soon called to the pastorate of 4 separate churches found across the counties of Loudoun County, Fairfax County, and Fauquier County, Virginia. For the first year of their marriage, they attempted to live on his salary from these combined churches, but they soon found that it was not possible. And admittedly, this was probably because his pastoral abilities in this era were less impressive than his teaching abilities. At least one of the churches that he was pastoring stopped paying him altogether, with a deacon indicating to him that they did not feel that they were getting what they were paying for. So he was forced to return to teaching at the Upperville Academy, which was a school for girls, in Middleburg. By 1820, he was asked to be the principal of that school. Now in 1819, Dagg was preaching in Dumfries when the building began to collapse on him. And while leaping from this falling building, he received an injury in his ankle that forced him to walk on crutches for the rest of his life. But despite that impediment, Dagg still sought to be active in the Baptist world, traveling to attend the newly formed Triennial Convention meetings, which was the first Baptist denomination in the United States. However, having returned from his first attendance of the Triennial Convention in 1823, he would spend the next 3 weeks trying to nurse his wife back to health as she had taken ill while he was gone. She would ultimately die, leaving him with 4 young children under the age of 6. His sister Sarah, who was many years younger than him, moved in and took up the care of his 4 children. Throughout that year, 1823, Dagg seems to have gone into some degree of a reclusive coping mechanism. He spent hours upon hours withdrawn in his study, studying Greek by candlelight, beginning at 4 o'clock in the morning and staying up into the very late hours of the evening, only interrupting his studies with the duties of the day. But this exhaustive reading with poor lighting seems to have so stressed his eyes that by the end of the year 1823, he had gone virtually blind. And so it was that at the age of 29, John Dagg was a widower with 4 children under the age of 6, who was unable to walk without assistance and unable to see. Now he continued preaching. He had his sister Sarah, or sometimes his oldest daughter, to read to him so that he could compose his sermons. And despite his maladies, he was still a highly sought-after preacher. At one point, he preached on a pulpit supply basis for the First Baptist Church of Richmond, Virginia, which was at that time the second largest Baptist church in America. At that same time, there was a newly established church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania called the Fifth Baptist Church, and they were occupying what was previously the Samson Street Baptist Church building, and they had begun searching for a pastor. Now, both First Baptist of Richmond and Fifth Baptist of Philadelphia extended calls to John Dagg at the same time. And First Baptist Church of Richmond was a thriving church that he had already preached at for a month. Fifth Baptist Church of Philadelphia, on the other hand, was a small, fledgling church struggling to come into existence in a borrowed building. And despite what would seem to most any person as an easy choice, Dagg felt that it was his duty to accept the call of the church in Philadelphia. And so he consequently became their pastor on the 1st of May, 1825. And to worldly eyes, this would have been a grave mistake, worthy of much regret. But God's hand was evidently on John Dagg, as the church grew from 82 members when he arrived to roughly 1,000 members by the end of his 9 years there. And one might wonder how magnanimous of a preacher he possibly could have been to attract all these people, but it doesn't seem to be strictly his preaching that saw this great feat accomplished. It appears that he was a very hard-working pastor. He considered it his duty to visit every member of his church at least once per year, and so consider the numbers there. By the end of his 9-year tenure, he's 1,000 members that he has to visit, which means that he had to visit at least 4 to 5 members per day to make up for Sundays and days of bad weather. And his church, because of this great work ethic, became incredibly charmed by him, as despite his obvious hardships, he was doing everything that he could to serve them. But this labor taxed him sorely. In 1830, he collapsed from exhaustion, and many of his friends thought he was going to die. He began to have moments when preaching in which his voice would suddenly disappear, only to return later after much retching and straining, until finally one day in April of 1834, while in the pulpit preaching, his voice suddenly sank into a whisper and never returned. After waiting all summer trying different approaches to remedy the issue, he accepted that he was now unable to preach and resigned from the church. He would never pastor again. At this point, one might wonder what possible service Dagg could have even offered to the Lord or to the world. Here in the year 1834, he is a 40-year-old widowed man with no formal education who was blind and crippled and unable to speak. And yet, through both the provision of God above and the love of those to whom Dagg had given his life, there always seemed to be an opportunity awaiting him just around the corner. For example, he had made friends with a man named Noah Davis while working with the American Baptist Publication Society. Davis was a co-founder of the society alongside Luther Rice. But Davis unexpectedly died in 1830 at a rather young age, leaving behind 2 children and a wife, Mrs. Mary Young Davis. 2 years later, Mary and John Dagg, having bonded over their joined widowhood, religious commitments, and stress of raising children alone, decided to get married. And so, the year before losing his voice, he gained a helpmeet in Mary Young, who would care for him and their now 6 combined children, as well as the one daughter, Mary Jane, whom they would have together, relieving John's younger sister after 8 years of tending to his children. Beyond that, the church in Philadelphia did not want to lose his services even despite his lost voice, so they approached him about leading a new school that they would form and fund called the Haddington Institute. And Dagg thought this was a great opportunity, and he therefore was given the position of president and professor of theology at the new school, alongside 2 or 3 other faculty members. Now bear in mind, this is an era in which there was a severe lack of Baptist theological institutions. The ones that even existed could be named quite easily. There was Brown University, there was Newton in Massachusetts, there was Hamilton in New York, there was the Virginia Baptist Institution in Virginia, and there was Furman in South Carolina. And at the time, that was it. For Baptists to go to school and get a good theological education from their own convictions perspective, that was it. So under Dagg's leadership, this institute, the Haddington Institution, was a great opportunity and a great asset to have. In fact, during his time there, they added a literary department and became known as the Haddington Literary and Theological Institution. But unfortunately, the timing could not have been worse in terms of finances. An economic collapse known as the Panic of 37 began immediately, and it wreaked havoc for several years. And even though the Baptist Education Society for the Central States was formed and even obtained a charter for the Haddington Institute to become the Haddington College, it was too little too late. They tried to transition to a manual labor method where students wouldn't even have to pay for tuition. They would just work on area farms, and that would be considered their tuition payment. And that had worked for schools like the Hearn Labor School in Cave Spring, Georgia, or the Rittenhouse Manual Labor School in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. But the student attendance at Haddington still fell, and the decision was ultimately made to try to move the school to Germantown and start over as the Germantown Collegiate Institute. Dagg ultimately decided to just resign in the middle of the year, and ultimately the efforts to restart the college just failed. So he finds himself in this interesting position. Tensions are growing in this era between pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners. Dagg is a Virginian who finds himself increasingly at odds with the culture all around him in Pennsylvania. And so his wife, Mary, introduces him to a man named R.W. Cushman. And Cushman arranges for Dagg to be offered the presidency of a newly formed school named the Alabama Female Athenaeum of Tuscaloosa. And the family moves to Tuscaloosa in the fall of 1836 and remains there for 8 years. And under his leadership, this school actually grew really well. It was originally started as a project of the University of Alabama, which at that point was under the leadership of President Alva Woods. The intention was to train women to be teachers, but several of the professors at the University of Alabama also taught classes to the ladies who were at this female school, now under John Dagg. Mary, his wife, was very active at this time herself. She had so much practice reading and orating for her blind and mute husband that she was actually made the chair of the rhetoric department. And she also played and taught piano and voice classes. Those who knew her described her as inexpressibly charming, and Dagg himself said that she was a phenomenal asset, especially in the church, because she led female prayer meetings and even organized Bible classes for young ladies, through which she led systematic studies of the Scripture. So clearly her assistance to John was making her a supremely educated woman in her day. Nevertheless, though, the Panic of 37 continued to crush many institutions, and the Alabama Female Athenaeum was no exception. It appeared that the school was not going to be able to keep going, and Dagg began entertaining offers for his next position in 1843. Now, he was offered 2 jobs that were tempting. The first was the chair of the theology department at Howard College, which is now Samford University in Marion, Alabama. And the second was a professorship of theology at a new college in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania that never has been named. Given the timing, it was probably either Villanova or Holy Cross, as both of those institutions were theological schools founded in Philadelphia in 1842 and 43. But while he's mulling these offers over, he receives word from a new friend that he had made through the female school's connection with the University of Alabama, Basil Manley Sr. Dr. Manley was the president of the University of Alabama, and he had recently been offered the presidency at a relatively new institution, Mercer University. He turned it down, but in his interview, he made the recommendation that Mercer hire a young president with years of experience that he knew back in Alabama, a man named John L. Dagg. And Mercer was very open because of Dagg's experience, but they didn't love the idea of calling a president who had no collegiate credentials. Well, no trouble, President Manley must have thought. So Dr. Manley contacts John Dagg, and he makes him aware that he is to receive an honorary doctorate of divinity from the University of Alabama at his recommendation, and that a job offer to serve as the president of Mercer University would be following it very soon. And Dagg received both of these offers quite gladly, and he and his family later moved to Penfield, Georgia, where he became the president of Mercer for 10 years. Dagg's presidency at Mercer was by far his most successful. When he got to Mercer, the institution was in a disastrous situation. The economic collapse had left them a full year behind on paying staff salaries. In December of 1842, the entire staff offered their immediate resignations, and this was sweepingly accepted by the Board of Trustees in July of 1843. Mercer also had essentially no real campus. Over half of their student body was taking high school or elementary level courses rather than college level courses. And even though the Georgia Baptist Convention desired for Mercer to be established as what they called the seminary of the South, they didn't offer any theological degree programs whatsoever. So Dagg gets to work immediately remedying these shortcomings. During his presidency, Mercer erected 4 new buildings, including the chapel, which still stands today and continues to be an operating church, the presidential home, which stood well into the 1970s, the Ciceronian Literary Society building, and a science building. He also addressed the issues with the student body. The number of students at Mercer doubled in the first 5 years, and it was on the verge of tripling by the time of his retirement in 1854. He also worked on the percentage of lower school students. He got that down to about 37%. And finally, he oversaw the addition of 3 full-time faculty members to the theology department, along with himself, and the launching of the Bachelor of Divinity degree program. But despite all of these accomplishments, Dagg's work was regrettably not appreciated by the Georgia Baptist Convention. In fact, in the minutes of their 1854 annual meeting, they said of Mercer, here's the quote, "Theological education has not received the encouragement which has been extended in other departments. Although we continue to believe that a theological seminary will one day develop as a part of Mercer University, this is one area in which our aspirations have not been accomplished." Now, Dagg was on the executive committee of the Georgia Baptist Convention at the time, so this negative and very public review of his efforts at Mercer just destroyed his morale. He had worked steadfastly to make Mercer a great theological institution, both as the president and as a professor of theology, only to have all of that work given such little regard by his peers. So that year, he offered his resignation as president. And his resignation was accepted under the agreement that he would stay on as a professor of theology, which he did until 1856, at which point he formally retired for what he described as health reasons. Now, whether Dr. Dagg retired from Mercer due to the painful review he received from his peers or due to genuine health concerns is a subject for speculation. On the one hand, he wrote to the editor of the Religious Herald shortly after retiring, saying, "It is my wish to fill the few remaining days of my pilgrimage with some useful services in the Master's cause." And this certainly leads readers to believe in his expectation of having only a few remaining days. You can also see the quickness with which he published in the following days as indicating the idea that he retired because of concerns over his short remaining lifespan. He retired in 1856 and published his first book the following year in 1857 entitled A Manual of Theology. This book, which turned out to be the first systematic theology by a Southern Baptist in America, and maybe the first systematic theology published in America at all if you don't consider Daniel Haskell's Elements of Theology, this work was monumental in its time. At just under 400 pages, he had written it with an intentionally less detailed manner when compared to John Gill's Body of Divinity that he was influenced by very greatly. He intended for it to be used by those who have not time and opportunity to study larger works on theology, and this manual was used as the systematics textbook at many institutions, including the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary for the first decade of its existence. It was only replaced by James P. Boyce's Abstract of Systematic Theology when he published it a decade later. It was also used at Union College in Tennessee under J.M. Pendleton, even despite his opposition to landmarkism in the book. And it was also continually used as a systematic theology at Mercer University, even well into the mid-1890s. The next year, 1858, Dagg published his Treatise on Church Order, a 300-page ecclesiology textbook, which later was republished along with the Manual of Theology as a single volume for complete theological studies. Now, while in his manual, Dagg had maintained consistency with his peers in the Calvinistic convictions of his Baptist forebearers, in his treatise, he markedly deviated from his peers in his rejection of landmarkism. In the book, he affirms the universal church and also recognized the legitimacy of pastors who had not been baptized by immersion. This was a big-time faux pas among the landmarkists. In 1859, he published The Elements of Moral Science, which proved to be the greatest stain on his reputation to ever flow out from under his pen. In this book, he gave a thorough defense of slavery on both moral and biblical grounds. And regrettable though this is, it was notably a year prior to the Civil War, written by a lifelong Southerner who was not alone in this stance, as Basil Manley Sr. had co-authored a general letter with Dagg in 1840, making similar positions. More will be said about this later. Finally, in 1869, a decade later, Dagg published The Evidences of Christianity, which was an apologetics textbook based largely on his lectures from the class called Christian Evidences that he had taught at Mercer and which he had been teaching since all the way back at his time in the Haddington Institute decades earlier. And although he published many other booklets and pamphlets, these 4 books would form Dagg's most important works. Now, his influence on the theological community is somewhat complicated, because in niche circles, he's sometimes compared to John Gill or Andrew Fuller in terms of influence over Calvinistic Baptists, and that would make him one of the leading figures. Those guys are at the top. As said, his text became staples in Southern Baptist institutions of theological learning. But it's also the case that they were very quickly supplanted by theological pieces of more academic credibility. It is the case, after all, that Dagg doesn't quote anything or anyone except the Bible in his manual, which some have taken as marking him as a biblicist apart from the standard academic practice. Within 10 years, his manual was replaced by the Abstract of Systematic Theology written by James P. Boyce. Boyce's works themselves were soon replaced by the works of E.Y. Mullins, and Mullins' works were soon supplanted by the works of W.T. Connor. But although it was Dagg who had laid the foundation for these Baptist theologians, his memory faded while the names of Boyce and Mullins continued on. In fact, it wasn't until 1982 that his manual was republished. And you see this not just with his manual, but with other works. Francis Wayland was a Northern Baptist who had written Elements of Moral Science in 1835, which was widely used as an ethics course textbook across the Baptist world until his grievances with slavery became irreconcilable with the convictions of the South. And consequently, Dagg penned his Elements of Moral Science in 1858 to take the place of Wayland's book, and he imitated not only the name, but the style of the book in almost every respect excepting slavery, which he defends. Now, Dagg never argued against anyone by name. He even made a concerted effort to ignore controversies, even of that magnitude in his day. He didn't say that he was trying to replace Francis Wayland, but that's ultimately what happened in the South. His book took the place of Francis Wayland's book from the Northern Baptist perspective. But you remember, The Elements of Science was published in 1859, 1 year before the Civil War. So immediately upon slavery's abolition, the book faded into obscurity. And so these are the reasons that he's been largely forgotten. He was just followed so quickly upon by a massively different culture and greatly more academically credible Baptist theologians like Boyce and Mullins. So maybe we can take these as reasons for his being forgotten, but they're not necessarily justifying. The man should be remembered and his works should be studied. Now, as we get closer to the end here, I want to give you a few quotes from John Dagg that you may remember. Most famously, Dagg wrote in his manual this quote, "When discipline leaves a church, Christ goes with it." Now, we mentioned previously that Dagg was oddly accepting of non-Baptists given his time and other thorough Baptist convictions. This quote struck me. He wrote at one point, Because we differ from other professors of religion in our faith and practice respecting the externals of religion, we are under a constant temptation to make too much account of these external peculiarities. Against this temptation we should ever struggle. If we magnify ceremony unduly, we abandon our principles and cease to fulfill the mission to which the head of the church has assigned us. The distinctives of our denomination must never be confused with the essentials of our faith. I think that last sentence is absolutely incredible. The distinctives of our denomination must never be confused with the essentials of our faith. Late in his life, reflecting on what aspect of his life he was the most proud of, he wrote, "I desire to mention the goodnesses of God to our family. All 5 of my children have professed faith in Christ. 2 of them have already gone to heaven, and the remaining 3 are on the way. Of my grandchildren, 17 have professed faith in Christ, and I trust are true disciples. If these 22 are heirs of the incorruptible inheritance, which is more than all the kingdoms that are upon earth, what a rich family we are. Let us all join in giving thanks to God for his ineffable blessings. However, let us not forget that there are still 9 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren who need Christ and his great salvation. So let us pray fervently for them, that they may all be brought into the flock of Christ, so that they may serve him faithfully on earth and be reunited with the others, thus forming a complete family in heaven." So despite all of the many things that Dr. Dagg did with his life, when he was asked, "What is that which you are most proud of in your life?" it was his family. Now, one reason that I have for doubting the legitimacy of Dr. Dagg's retirement on the basis of health purposes is that after his retirement in 1856, he went on to live another 28 years. It wasn't until 1870, 14 years later, that he was forced to move in with his daughter, Sarah Rugeley. And even then, he lived another 14 years with her. Now, notably, after he moved in with her, he did fall in very poor health and spent the last 13 years of his life almost fully bedridden. But that means he had 15 full years after his retirement in which he was more or less able-bodied to the best of his capacity. I don't know whether he retired on the basis of health or if he was truly that hurt over the Georgia Baptist Convention's reflection on his work. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me in the comments. John Leadley Dagg died in Hayneville, Lowndes County, Alabama, on the 11th of June, 1884, at the age of 90. At his own request, he was buried in an unmarked grave in the Hayneville Cemetery. Decades later, Georgia Baptists felt it a shame that there was no monument to this Baptist hero. And so in 1957, the Committee on Baptist History of the Georgia Baptist Convention erected a marker at the approximate location where Dagg was believed to have been buried. The marker reads, "Minister, teacher, scholar, writer, college president. One of the ablest and wisest theologians of his day, author of Manual Theology, Evidences of Christianity, and etc., outstanding advocate of missions, temperance, and benevolence in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Alabama, and Georgia. Distinguished by the brilliance of his intellect, the wealth of his knowledge, the sublimity of his faith, the serenity of his spirit, the purity of his life." As you're probably gleaning, I am astounded at the lack of awareness that most people, especially Baptists, have of Dr. Dagg. His lasting legacy is unfathomable given what he contributed to the Baptist world. In fact, in the most recent literary piece written on John Dagg, the author comments that his obscurity is quite an enigma, and I find that to be an understatement. I want to give a list of his accolades, and these are some that I can find just real easily without really diving into the primary resources. Regarding his work as a national Baptist, he was on the board of managers of the Triennial Convention from 1826 to 36. He was the host pastor of the Triennial Convention in 1829, the vice president of the Triennial Convention from 1838 to 45. He was on the board of directors of the American Baptist Home Missionary Society from 1832 to 36, the vice president of the American and Foreign Bible Society from 1837 to 43. He served as the president, vice president, and in many other positions over the Baptist General Tract Society from 1824 to 43. He was one of the 10 men appointed to arrange for the 1845 dissolution of the American Baptist Home Mission Society. He was the inaugural vice president of the Southern Baptist Domestic Missions Board, which later became the Home Mission Board and now the North American Mission Board. He was the chair of the Chinese Missionary Committee in the Southern Baptist Convention, a representative of the American Sunday School Union to the Southern Baptist Convention, and one of the authors of the Constitution of the Southern Baptist Convention. In Pennsylvania, he was responsible for the 1825 formation of the Pennsylvania Baptist Missionary Association, which ultimately became the Pennsylvania Baptist Convention. He was an officer of the society from 1825 to 27. He was elected president thereof in 1831 and elected executive director in 1833. In Alabama, he was the vice president of the Alabama Baptist Convention in 1843 and the founder and two-time president of the Alabama Baptist Bible Society. In Georgia, he was installed on the Georgia Baptist Convention's Executive Committee immediately following his arrival in Georgia and remained thereon from 1844 to 1855. He represented the state of Georgia at the 1845 meeting in Augusta, Georgia, wherein the Southern Baptist Convention was formally created, and he, of course, again, was one of the authors of the Constitution at that time. So why in the world doesn't this guy have more of a reputation? Well, one person might say because he defended slavery so adamantly. Maybe he was a racist. And certainly, by modern standards, he would be called a racist today. But that label might be improper, and it's a somewhat nuanced conversation that needs to be had. Dagg did fall into the common trap of his day wherein they used the curse of Ham in Genesis as justification for the enslavement of the African people. But aside from this, his defense of slavery is largely an argument for slavery as an institution, rather than the racially based chattel slavery as practiced in America. The difference being that Dagg generally saw slavery as an institution in which those who owed debts would work them off, more akin to indentured servitude than the hereditary chattel slavery practiced in his time. And this is why Dagg could defend the institution of slavery as a moral good and biblical position, yet also spend his life seeking ways for Baptists to do mission work among the Native Americans in western Pennsylvania, or the Cherokee Nation in Georgia, or the Chinese in China. In fact, one very little known thing about John Dagg is that he made a monumental impact on the missionary work that was done to black slaves in Brazil. See, while Dagg was working at the Alabama Female Athenaeum, he received a letter from a 22-year-old student named William Carey Crane, who was asking his advice on whether to come south or not. Crane was a student at Columbian College, now known as George Washington University, and Dagg was on the board of trustees there. And Dagg responded by compelling him to come pastor a Baptist church in Montgomery, Alabama. And it was this singular encouragement that brought Crane to the American South. Crane received Dr. Dagg's endorsement as a gold stamp, came to the South for the first time since going to college, continued to pastor and get secondary education, and eventually became the president at Baylor University. And it was while he was president at Baylor that he used his authority as president to push for mission work to the slaves in Brazil. So it could be said that without the influence of John Dagg over Dr. Crane, those mission works in Brazil would never have been done. And Crane is only one example of this sort of impact. Rollin D. Mallory, who was a graduate of Mercer during Dagg's presidency, would go on to become the president of Southwestern Baptist College in Cuthbert, Georgia, and Shorter College in Rome, Georgia, and the Shelby Female College in Shelby, North Carolina. Dagg's son, John Francis Dagg, would go on to become the editor of the Christian Index from 1851 to 57, and the president of the Cuthbert Female College in Cuthbert, Georgia from 1861 to 66, and the president of the Bethel Female College in Hopkinsville, Kentucky from 1866 to 72. Dagg's stepson, Noah K. Davis, from Mary's first husband, graduated from Mercer during Dagg's presidency and went on to teach at Howard College, which again is now Samford University. He was elected president of the Bethel College in Russellville, Kentucky in 1868, and ultimately retired as the professor of moral philosophy at the University of Virginia. Dagg's son-in-law, S.G. Hillier, who married his daughter Elizabeth, would become a trustee and ultimately professor at Mercer University. So clearly, His influence stretched not just from his own life, but from the people that he influenced, having a major influence over Baptist and academic life all over. Now, to this day, the academic works examining Dagg's life are legion. There have been 4 individuals to write Master of Theology theses on him, beginning with Hillier Stratton in 1926, Thomas Catino in 1954, Mark Dever in 1987, and Paul Sanchez in 2012. And in addition to those, 4 doctoral dissertations have been written on various aspects of his life, starting with Robert Gardner in 1957, Paige Patterson in 1974, Mark Matheson in 1984, and Jared Longshore in 2016. And given all of this impact on every level of Baptist denominational and academic life, perhaps Jared Longshore said it best in his recent PhD dissertation, as I've already quoted, his obscurity is quite an enigma. Yeah, it is very, very odd that Dagg's legacy is so shrouded in ignorance. In the course of preparing for this episode, I was absolutely shocked when I read, I have a copy of James Lester's 850-page tome, The History of the Georgia Baptist Convention from 1822 to 1972. I was absolutely shocked that John Dagg is not mentioned one time in the entire book. He is not mentioned as a member of the executive committee of the Georgia Baptist Convention. He is not mentioned as being the representative of the Georgia Baptist Convention to the Augusta meeting in which he formed the Southern Baptist Convention and assisted in writing the Constitution. He's not even mentioned as being the president of Mercer University, which is the premier university of the Georgia Baptist Convention until around the early 2000s. He's not named a single time, either in a line or a footnote in the entire book. It's unbelievable. In the 141 years since his death, there has never been a single biography written or published on the life of John Dagg. Mark Dever, who we just mentioned, wrote a THM thesis on him, laments the lack of a biography on Dagg and points out the difficulty of coming up with an accurate picture of his life. He writes, his life must be pieced together from his very sketchy autobiography, correspondence, and dissertations written on some aspect of his theology, and thus mistakes are frequently made concerning Dagg. Combining various authors' errors, Dagg becomes a Princeton graduate who was pastor of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia and died in 1888, while not one of these 3 facts is true. Dever alludes there to Dagg's autobiography, which was posthumously published by his family, but it must be noted that Dagg wrote that manuscript with the explicit instruction that it was intended only for his family, and therefore was never intended to be used as a meaningful chronicle of his life. Perhaps of all of his published works, this autobiography is the most difficult to obtain. But thankfully, the Particular Baptist Heritage Books is now in the process of publishing a 5-volume set of the works of John Dagg, with all 4 of his major works and a full transcription of his autobiography. It's my sincere hope that through biographical sketches such as this one, and the work of Particular Baptist Heritage Books and increasing accessibility to the works of John Dagg, that in the near future someone will be inspired to write a proper biography on him. I believe it is sorely needed. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Baptist Directory. Again, I'm Dr. Michael Schultz. I'll see you guys later. Bye.